We're here in the Capitol. Here is the capital of the state of South Dakota, and we've got the Capitol building behind us and adjacent to Capitol Lake, one of the highlights of Pierre, South Dakota. The state of South Dakota really developed in two ways. So Dakota started as Dakota Territory in 1861, and then in 1889, South Dakota and North Dakota both became states. Well, at the time of statehood, eastern South Dakota had been settled for a number of years. A lot of farmers came over from Minnesota, Iowa, other places in the Midwest. The western half of South Dakota was the Great Sioux Indian Reservation. And so the development of western South Dakota really lagged behind the east in every considerable respect. And so the ranching culture that grew up in western South Dakota happened far later than the farming culture of eastern South Dakota, and was absolutely essential to the way in which South Dakota developed as a state. The book I wrote is called Controlled Recklessness. It's a story of Ed Lemon and the development of western South Dakota. Ed Lemon's kind of a foundational figure in the history of the state of South Dakota. He was a cowboy, he was a cattleman, he had an 865,000 acre ranch in western South Dakota in the early 1900s. He was involved in the expansion of the railroad into western South Dakota, also at that same time in the early 1900s, and was one of the figures that was really essential to the growth and development of western South Dakota. You know, a lot of people think of South Dakota as a corn and beans farming kind of a state. Certainly South Dakota is more than that. Of the about 800,000 people that we've got in the state right now, we've also got almost 4 million head of cattle, so almost 5 for every single man, woman, and child in the state. Ed Lemon was involved in the expansion of that cattle ranching industry, primarily in western South Dakota, which was essential, along with mining and the expansion of the railroad, into the growth of our state in the early part of the 20th century. Ed Lemon came to western South Dakota in the glory days of cattle ranching, the open range, no fences, and not much to speak of for law enforcement either, and so they kind of made their own way. He came to South Dakota with a company called the Shidley Cattle Company in the 1880s, and they made their living primarily by ranching with a headquarters adjacent to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And they had their ranch headquarters adjacent to the reservation, and then they grazed their cattle on the reservation. They were trespassers. And so they made their living raising cattle that were driven up from Texas and other areas in the South, not on the hoof, not on the Chisholm Trail or other trails, but via the railroad. The railroad brought in thousands and thousands of head of cattle where they were raised in western South Dakota. Ed Lemon was part and parcel to that. You know, in 1897, he bossed one of the largest cattle roundups ever, more than 50,000 head of cattle in just a handful of days, 500 roundup wagons. We're talking about a tremendously huge operation, and that really was typical of western South Dakota in the late 1890s, early 1900s. Large cattle operators, hundreds of thousands of head being rounded up at the same time, and then driven to railheads for marketing in Chicago and other places. One of the things that they did was they illegally grazed their cattle on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Well, cattlemen and Indians often had a very good relationship rather than a contentious relationship. And Ed Lemon really personified that. He would, when he grazed his cattle on the reservation, invite any Indians who are interested in coming and sharing a meal with his cowboys, coming and sharing the campfire with them. And whenever he would have cattle that weren't fit for market, he would provide those for free, no cost, to the Indians. And as a result, they turned the other way when he was grazing on the reservation. It was a close connection that he had, and really manifested itself decades later when he had an 865,000 acre ranch, 865,000 acre ranch on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. One of the things that the Indians called him was Tazpazi. So in Lakota, it was Tazpazi Pa, which means yellow apple. Well, why would you call him yellow apple? Lemon, like the fruit, there's no name for the word lemon in Lakota, but of course they did know what an apple was, and they had a word for the name yellow, and so it got Anglicanized into Tazpazi, and so that's what they called Ed Lemon because of this relationship that he had with them. He was a known quantity and a guy who helped them as much as he helped himself. Ed Lemon was really involved in the open range cattle industry, and he actually was involved with the sunsetting of that open range industry to more of fenced pastures. In fact, he was one of the guys who helped establish the way of ranching of fenced pastures with his 865,000 acre lease. It all had a single boundary fence around it. And so it was this massive 210-mile long 3-strand barbed wire fence around the perimeters, no interior fencing. And so he sort of took some of the techniques that he used in the open range cattle industry and then transferred them into fenced pastures. But even today in western South Dakota, where it's been carved up into a lot of different smaller ranches, a 10,000 acre ranch is not uncommon at all in western South Dakota. And every cow that ends up on a dinner plate as beef starts out as a calf grazing on grass in some place like western South Dakota. And so while we might think of the cattle industry growing and evolving from open range cattle that were Texas Longhorns driven up on these cattle trails to now the beef that shows up in your supermarket, the origins of those calves that were born on the range aren't much different than they are today. Born on the ranges of western South Dakota under much the same conditions, the same skies, the same grass that they did a century or more ago. Ed had written hundreds and hundreds of stories about his own life. In the 1930s, after he was long retired from the cattle business, he was in his 70s at the time, he wrote an article for the Belle Fourche Bee called Developing the West. And so out of these stories, one is able to glean a really good insight into Ed Lemon as a person, as an individual. Controlled Recklessness is the story of Ed Lemon, cowboy cattleman, town founder, but then it also mirrors the growth and development of western South Dakota. Both shared similar characteristics. On the controlled part, Ed Lemon was a very cerebral guy. He was organized, he was methodical, he was intelligent, and so from bossing a roundup of 50,000 head to the way in which he organized his cattle roundups to the way in which he ran his operation, he was very controlled. At the same time, he had a wild and reckless streak. He wasn't one for shirking danger, whether it was stampedes or swollen rivers or Indian engagements. He wasn't one to back down. That mirrors the growth and development of western South Dakota. It was ostensibly a controlled process. The government had fixed plans for the way in which one could homestead. You went and you filed papers, you got a 160 or 320 acre parcel of land. It was all designed to be very methodical. But the reality was much different. There were claim jumps. You would file land claims under your name or your wife's name or your fictitious brother's name. It was very reckless in the way in which it was implemented. So controlled recklessness really recognizes the two competing halves of both the growth and development of the Northern Great Plains and Ed Lemon's personality. Controlled on one hand, a little bit less controlled or reckless on the other. Ed Lemon is a guy who's all around you, but he's just right underneath the surface, and so you might not necessarily see him when he's there. So for instance, of course, the community of Lemon, South Dakota, his namesake town, there's a beautiful metal sculpture there by sculptor John Lopez in his image. The entire railroad that is now the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad on the northern part of South Dakota, that was all designed originally as the Milwaukee Railroad because of him. The communities of Timberlake, of Buffalo, of Lemon, South Dakota, of Mobridge were really established as a result of his involvement. Ed Lemon is a figure that could very often be mistaken for just some regional character, some bit player in the development of a single state. But Lemon is quite a bit more than that. In much the same way that, say, Charlie Goodnight or Oliver Loving, these famous cattlemen that Lonesome Dove was designed after or that was based on. Lemon is that to the Northern Great Plains. So Oliver Loving, Charlie Goodnight in the Southern Great Plains were these guys who helped establish communities, who helped to develop more than just their own individual cattle ranches. Ed Lemon did that in the Northern Great Plains, helping to guide the railroad, helping to establish settlements. He founded a variety of different towns during his time in the Northern Great Plains. All of these things combined brought people to the region far beyond any one typical cattle drive or any one cattleman ever could. He helped to put in place systems that brought people here, and it's part of the fabric of western South Dakota and the Northern Great Plains as a whole.